Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. and today I'm reviewing Mutants from Lucky Duck Games. And Mutants is a unique enough game that I don't have a quick 15-second blurb of how to explain it. The core concept of the game is that you're going to be building out your deck. You're going to start the game by going through a giant selection full of cards. These are just some of them. There's an entire box full of so many cards. So many cards to go through. And you're going to be drafting these cards. You're going to get a hand of cards, you're going to start drafting, and you're going to be building your unique deck before you even start the game. Once you're done drafting, you're going to go through another pile finding the matching pair. You see, every card comes in a pair of two. You're not just drafting a singular card. When you take that card, you're drafting two cards. And you're going to be building out your potential deck of 6 unique beasts, 12 unique cards that will be over here in your breeding pool where you can potentially be adding them to your deck as you play the game. So you're effectively building out your potential upgrade path before you even start the game. The reason you're doing that, the reason you're trying to build this out is because you're ultimately competing in an arena over here. Your goal is to play both defensively, manipulatively, a little bit of control, a little bit of abilities, a little bit of deck building, a little bit of straight up attacking each other in order to get higher and higher in the arena. We'll explain how that works. It's not immediately intuitive. Think about it practically speaking as doing damage to the other players, although with a slight different take on the way that's being done in this game system. From there, you're going to start going across the 5 rounds of play. Once you have your 12 potential cards, and then you also have your starting deck, which represents, again, another 12 cards, 6 unique cards, 2 copies of each, but these are like fairly basic cards that are the core building blocks of your gene pool, and this is actually a gene pool because that's how you start building out your unique beasts. Because you're going to have your hand of starting cards, you'll have 1 of each gene and your starting hand, and that's important because then you have a few different options as you go through it. The first step, which we can skip the first turn because nothing's really happened over here. Let's move these down a bit. We're going to skip the first step, the first turn, nothing's actually happened. Then you move your active mutant to the left to the right. Again, we're going to skip that. We'll talk about that in a second once we have things done. Then you start taking actions. You can take an action to deploy, breed, or incubate. Deploy is when you take a card from your hand and you play it down over here and potentially do its deployability if it has one. Simple enough. A breed is going to be where you grab one of these cards over here and put that over here, but it's a little more complicated because the way you do that is you look at your starting hand, you find the matching elements. In this case, let's go ahead and go for these 2 over here. We're going to grab these 2 cards here. They have the matching elements into this buffalo over here. We're going to grab that buffalo and immediately add it to our pool. So we're giving up 2 cards, which is a bit of a cost. Instead of being able to do these 2 cards, we're giving them up entirely, putting them into our discard pile, and then where's our discard over here? And then from there, we get to activate the ability, the deployability on this card, as well as showing the next card. We're going to go ahead and do that because we want to start building our deck. As much as I want to utilize both these cards, I'd rather start building out my deck. Those cards that I spent so much time drafting and building out a good combination of cards that work well together, I want to start executing on them. And so now I have these cards. We're going to go ahead and add this here. And this card, because it has a deploy effect over here, I'm going to go ahead and move up my marker 2 and go 1 forward onto that spot. And then whenever I go forward while on the top spot, I move all players back 1 spot. So effectively, you're trying to move your way to the top. You're trying to become king of the arena. And as you slowly move up, once you go to that top spot, you start moving everyone else back every single other time you move forward. So it's not really pure damage in typical sense. It's about widening the gap between yourself and your other players, especially if you can get them far enough behind. Then you'll do what's called crushing the competition, where you get a bunch of extra points for, well, crushing the competition. The last action you take is a way of getting cards into your pool without having to pay quite as premium a cost, but you don't get them right away. So for example, I can go ahead and discard a single card to go ahead and grab any one of these, and I'll go ahead and grab this card over here and put it into my incubator pool where it will enter my deck. It'll go onto the top of my deck at the end of the round, so it's cheaper, it doesn't require matching the elements. The downside is you're not getting it right away. Once again, those are the 3 actions you take on your turn. You play a card over here, you resolve the effects of that card, you breed, adding a card to your pool, or you alternatively incubate, adding a card to the incubation pool, but then we'll get it next round. Now, part of what we hadn't talked about yet is as you start adding cards to your pool over here, to your deck, to your board, you'll be moving cards to the left or to the right. So if I go ahead and on a future turn, if I shove this down over here, I can play a card and I shove this to the left or to the right, and the placement does matter. And then when I do that again, if I go ahead and push this again, which will shove that guy to the left or the right, this will push him out. You have this sequence where everything is slowly entering play, then being pushed down or left to the right, and then eventually, this one's actually, here we have this one over here, and this one's now exiting play. And because it's exiting play, we do the exit playability, where we're going to freeze this mutant, and then you're going to gain a mutant from your gene pool to your discard. So this guy, he entered play, he did 2 damage, now he goes to our freezer pool where he's going to be worth points at the end of the game, and we immediately add another mutant to our discard pile, potentially freeing that up. So you're starting to build a chain of abilities that will take place when you play cards, a chain of abilities that will take place when you leave cards. There's a bunch of different options on these cards as the different things that they happen when you play or leave play. Sometimes there's other options as well as far as when they trigger, when they're attacking, when they're defending, different things like that. But you're trying to build out your board as you go. Now, strictly speaking, you're taking actions one at a time. While I showed you all the actions over here, the other player is responding in kind, trying to play their own actions, and that's important, especially because these lanes matter. For the sake of the camera over here, I have them facing this way, but normally you'd be facing each other, and you'd be dealing damage to players' left or right lanes where you start getting involved in defensive abilities. Some of these cards over here have defensive abilities where they trigger on defense, you get +1 strength, and you knock down this mutant. So you go ahead and you're trying to modify those things as well, trying to build defensively, build aggressively, build manipulatively, or trying to get cards in your freezer as well. Dealing with the freezer is a huge part of the game, both in terms of the fact that you generally have necromancer abilities going on that can raise things from the dead, but also because you're going to get points for every card in your freezer at the end of the game. At the end of every round of the 5 rounds, you're going to get points for, well, at the start of the round, if you're crushing the competition, you'll get points there, but additionally you'll get points at the end of the round, these first and second place points that you can see over here at the end of each round for how you're doing on this track. Additionally, you'll get points at the end of the game for your freezer, and that's basically what's happening in Mutants. Once again, a quick recap, now that you have that framework, you start the game with a pre-game draft where you build out your potential upgrade pool that you're going to be building from across the next 5 rounds. You're trying to do so to have the best combination of abilities that play off one another, that do things when other things are in play. You might have a mutant in play that says every time you deal damage, deal an extra damage. Every time you cycle a card, go ahead and put something into your freezer. You have different abilities that will play off one another in different ways, and a reminder that once again, you have all these cards over here. This is with expansions, to be fair, but you have all these cards with giving you tons of ways you can mix and match and build out different ability combinations as you slowly but surely head towards an end game where hopefully you manage to dominate your opponent, either through actual domination or just by having the most points possible at the end of 5 rounds. And that's how you play Mutants from Lucky Duck Games. As far as the review, starting off with ease of play. The rules are fairly easy to get through. The rulebook's not that long. It's not the most intuitive. Some of the things this game is doing is different enough, which is a pro in the sense that it's a unique experience, but it's a con in the sense that you have to kind of explain some of this card cycling and the way you're building, the way you're doing things. It's not a deck builder, although it is a game where you build your deck. It's not a typical drafting game because you're drafting pre-game, not mid-game. You are dealing damage to each other, but you're not actually dealing actual damage. You're just modifying your relative positions on tracks. It does enough things that are unique that both the rulebook and the teach are not going to be the most intuitive, despite not being that complex in the actual rules themselves. Table space is fairly minimal. Basically, you're looking at this main board over here, and then this board per player. That's as far as table space. As far as game time, generally I find this is roughly 45 minutes. It can range a bit, but roughly in that range. As far as player count, it's a 1 to 4 player game. I have played this at 2 and 3 only. I have heard the solo is very good. I have not dived into the solo myself just yet. I would not want to play it at 4. I would say that in general, I feel that 2 and 3 are the sweet spot for me. Slight preference towards 3 over 2, but 4, I haven't played it, but it feels like we start getting a little messier and a little bit too much in each other's faces as opposed to having just enough drag down the leader that 3 provides. And then interaction is very high. You have the initial pre-game draft where you're all drafting to build out your own decks, being mindful of what may or may not come back, and then in the game itself, you are attacking each other. You are trying to actively hurt each other so that you can dominate and crush the competition and score as many points as possible at the end of the round. You have a little bit of a solo thing going on in terms of the way you manage your deck, your freezer, things like that, but for the most part, that's almost a side thing. You're going to be getting a lot of points and energy through the interaction with others and the attacking of them throughout the course of the game. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking, starting off with that pre-game draft. I love drafting, it's my favorite game mechanic, and that doesn't change in this game. Now, I do recommend, there are ways you can have starting decks or just give someone a set of cards. Your first game, you're not going to understand enough about how things interplay together for that pre-game draft to be that meaningful. But once you have your first game out of the way, drafting that pre-game is a lot of fun as you try to sit there and build out your competitive advantage, what you're going to focus on, what you're going to use to complement each other. It's a lot of fun to do so. And then the fact that you get 2 cards for every card you draft effectively means you're actually building out a nice synergy of abilities while having enough control because of that doubling that it works well together. And so I really like the pre-game draft, and the whole thing is powers and abilities. The entire game is powers and abilities left, right, and center. Every card comes into play with 2 powers and abilities, often an entering and a leaving play, also some variation around that, but the entire game is powers and abilities. Mutants is powers and abilities combined with drafting, which gives me things that I like in the game. And then the fact that you have different ways of building out your deck. You have actual just straight up abilities on cards, so you can draft cards that will help you get other cards into your deck, or alternatively between the breeding and the incubating, you have that little catch-all of breeding is the more effective way to get things moving quickly, but incubating can help you if you're in a pinch and you want to ensure that you're still getting some form of deck building with a lower cost but also not as quickly of a reward. So I like the multiple pathways towards how you can build your deck. And then the sheer variability. Like I've already picked this up twice, I'll pick it up a third time. There's a ton of variability to the experience to the extent that I haven't felt the need to dive into many of the expansions just yet. Even the base game has plenty of cards that you will not see them in multiple plays. It will take a whole bunch of plays under your belt before you feel you've seen everything in the base game, and that's where you can start mixing in expansion content and just further adding to the sheer amount of powers and abilities you can be working together with, all with the goal of building different pathways towards victories, which is another thing I like. The fact that you can heavily, you can't ignore the arena. You definitely can't ignore it. You have to be mindful of it because other players will be crushing you if you are ignoring it. So you have to be on top of it to some degree. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the main source of points for you. You can build decks that heavily reward the freezer while being just competitive enough in the arena to deny other people's points. Or you can heavily focus on the arena and just charging people down, driving them further and further into the ground, and then crushing the competition every single round. If you can do that, you can get a chunk full of points, and so I like that aspect. And then the deck thinning. Inherently, the freezer is both a point system and a way of thinning your deck, thinning your starting cards. Across 5 rounds, that might not seem like you have a lot of draws. You will, but you get even more if you do effectively thin your deck, both getting points into your freezer, as well as having your best and most powerful cards really working together once you weed out those starting cards, which again, if you draft the right cards, you can be doing that a lot. And so I like deck thinning in general, and this rewards you for it twice over, both for the better deck and the points you're getting in the freezer. As far as things I don't like, the primary thing I don't like about Mutants is going to be that lack of intuitiveness to the game system. While it is unique in what it's doing, and that is a good thing to a degree, it also means that explaining this has been a bit of a mess each time. I often find that for me, with Mutants, with teaching new players, that first game is almost a write-off. They don't understand what they're doing or why. It's just enough, there's enough commonality you can teach them the rules and they hear and understand, but I find consistently that first game, or the first half a game, is kind of just a pure write-off as players are like, okay, I'll start doing this, and then things start to click. Then they start playing cards, they start having abilities used against them, and it starts to make sense. Like, oh, okay, fine, we're 2 rounds in, now I get it. Why don't we restart and actually draft and actually play the game? And I've done that multiple times with people. I've done that, play 2 rounds, and then completely restart with a draft, and suddenly they get that gleam in their eyes as they start looking at the abilities that the first time round they didn't understand at all what was happening. And now they're looking at them very, very mindful of the fact that they can actually do these cool things and combine things in cool and powerful ways. Secondly, I would say that if you can have games, depending on how you build your deck, depending on how other players build a deck, depending on what players do, you can have aggressive games where you sat there and built something that was going to do really cool stuff, and the other players just smash you down into the ground again and again and again. And this is a you problem. This is something that it's your fault. It's not the way you built a deck, but it can be frustrating until you figure that out. The idea that you build out these cool combinations, but you don't actually focus on defense or aggression at all, and other players are just stomping on you and hurting you and removing your cards from play because they can do that. There are ways to attack other players' cards, flipping them so you don't get to execute those abilities. And so this cool engine you built never really gets to execute because you're just being attacked the whole way through. Now, again, this is something that isn't a problem that often. Often, once it happens to you once, you start being a little bit mindful of playing defensively at the same time, but it is something that can happen, and you can have a dud of a game while you figure out, next time I'm going to build my deck differently when I play this game. As far as I can see others not liking, first of all, there's the inherent luck of the draw. The way your deck comes out, the way your Mutants flip out over here, there is a mulligan aspect to the starting play, but after that, you can just have cards that don't sync well. You can draft cards that you need the same elements to breed them every single round, therefore you're only getting 1 card out that first round, and other players are getting 2 out, or 3 out even. So you could have some degree of luck in just the way things come out. Not a huge amount, but enough to have an impact. And the second is that conflict system can very much reward tanking the bottom player again and again and again. You're just pushing people down further and further on the track, and then tracking others' abilities. Sometimes it's a little bit, if you're facing each other and you're tracking other people's abilities, trying to see, okay, you play a card. This is a game where we've developed as a, not house rule, but just common courtesy, when we play something that impacts other players, we announce it. When we say, hey, we just played a card, this one could potentially hurt the person on your right, we've taken to announcing it because we found that otherwise it drags down the game, forcing other players to either spend extra time trying to look at your cards. Did you play anything this round? Did you play anything this round? We find it saves a lot of time if we just go with that common courtesy obviously understand that is very much a group-dependent thing. You might be in a group that prefers that aspect of I sneakily play a card that's going to hurt you in a second, but only if you don't notice. So that does come down to group preference. We prefer just interacting and telling each other so that we save the time of having to pay that extra degree of attention to one another's tableaus as you go through the game. As far as final thoughts on Mutants, Mutants is a game that very much surprised me. This is a game that I kind of wrote off. It initially came out, it launched, there wasn't a lot of buzz or reception around the game, and I just didn't play it. It's one of many games that just exist in the nether space out there of way too many board games, and I didn't dive into it. And then One Stop Co-op Shop mentioned it in a review that they particularly enjoyed it, and I was like, hey, it sounds fun, it has powers and abilities. Now that we have a stamp of approval on it as well, I'll go ahead and check it out. And I'm very, very glad I did. This is one that is a lot of fun. The drafting is a lot of fun. It can be a little random or chaotic at times. It may or may not be. It's not going to be some heavier experience. It's very much drafting, powers and abilities, and stomping each other into the ground until you eventually win. But it does so with a lot of variability. It does so very fast-paced. It has these amazing players I haven't even talked about. Just two very simple cards, double-sided. You can use them. They show you all the abilities. Anything you have any questions on, just going to be on those cards. Give you the turn sequence and the iconography that you need as you go through the game. Overall, this is a really good game. It's one I really, really have come to enjoy quite a bit. It's a 3.5 out of 5 for me. It's a little chaotic at times in different ways, but at the same time, it's one that I'm really happy every time I get it to the table. If you're looking for other game recommendations, it has, to a similar degree, the similar feeling of Smash Up from AEG in the way you just build out your decks and start going at each other, although it's an interesting recommendation because I like Mutants a bit, quite a bit, and I don't actually like Smash Up, but it has some of the same feeling as far as the games. And then also from AEG, it actually feels very similar to Nightfall, a game that I have not played in a long time, but something about the deck construction, the deck building, and the way you go at each other, something about it reminds me of Nightfall. Also in the innovation and the uniqueness of both of those systems, although I can't put a hard finger on it, but I did play Nightfall quite a bit when it first came out and really enjoyed that one as well. Until next time, I am Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this video as helpful, and as always, have a good one.